To the Anthropology Club Lunch and Lecture, the very last one, not only for the year, but then also for Dr. Thompson as well. Just a brief announcement, if everyone could refrain from questions till the very end of the lecture. Additionally, there will be a final Anthropology Club meeting after the lecture. So without further ado, Dr. Thompson on Stories We Live By, the use of stories in teaching and conversation.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Also, this is, at least my plan was to make this quite informal, so I really don't mind if you have questions in the middle of it, for our purposes here. And I have like two classes just before this, one at 10, one at 11. I have another one after this. And I'm getting on in years, and so I'm afraid I'm going to sit down or something in the middle of it. Oh, actually, I won't because there's no chair, but maybe on the floor. But if that happens, I beg your forgiveness. Yeah, the very first, years ago when I came here, in the Anthropology Club was just starting. They used to meet in this little room over in what's now the Liberal Arts Building. And it was the same room that they kept the archaeological stuff. There was a table in there and people sit around. There'd be other faculty and a few students. And I think the first one I gave, I just sat down and told stories that I had helped edit and translate when I was working with the Koyukon people in Alaska. And later on, my kind of presentations got more sophisticated, more professor-like, but originally it was just to sit down and tell some stories. And so when the Anthropology Club contacted me and said, would you like to give a presentation? This is, I guess, last month sometime, we worked out today. My first reaction is this, oh man, I just want to retire. I'm retiring at the end of this year. I really don't want to do any more work. But then I thought, wow, I could just tell stories. I kind of have bookends to my Anthropology Club presentations. But, being too much of a professor now, I started to think more about it. And just some things were have been gnawing at me over the years in terms of my linguistic work. And so what you're about to see is just a beginning of some of the thoughts I might develop if we're going to stay here longer. But I probably will continue to develop after I retire. And actually my view of retirement is just keep doing what I'm doing. So. Now, when I came up with this title, actually I was thinking of a book by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, Metaphors We Live By, which was the beginning of a series of books co-edited by Lexical, having to do with metaphor and cognition. And it was the beginning of the idea of the embodied mind, where our metaphor and the way we think is actually based on the way we interact physically with the world. So we understand abstractions using metaphors from our physical interactions. And so actually that was what I was thinking, but it occurred to me that actually I had edited and helped translate a book of Koyukon stories called Stories We Live By, was actually the name of the talk I was going to give today. What was I didn't come up with the title, it was the Koyukon people themselves thought that this was a good title. And if you read the stories in that book, they're really strange. Like as a non-Koyukon person, even though I was familiar with the culture, You know, even as familiarized as I was, I couldn't see how these related to anyone's life. So, I mean, there are things, I mean, fantastic things happen in stories quite a bit, but I couldn't quite see the point. Like some of them have happy endings, like someone goes on a long journey and comes back home, but a different story, like one that takes years to tell, not years, weeks to tell. It's just like the guy, the protagonist turns into a bird at the end. But you know, in this story, that long one is not in this book, but there's a story where a guy is walking along, you know, in the woods and is attacked by a giant blueberry coming from the sky. And he's aware, and so he clubs it and kills it. And then people camp around the blueberry and eat it for a long time until they run out of blueberry, and then he's attacked by a giant lynx. And anyway, so I couldn't, they wanted to, we lived by these stories, but I couldn't see how. One of the things when I worked in Alaska, the Department of Education asked us to develop a series of booklets for teachers going to the villages in Alaska, the State Department of Education, and I was asked to do the one on Athabascan people. So it's called Athabascan Language in the Schools. And we talked about a variety of things. But one of the things I thought I would like to do is to talk about traditional methods of education. And so just on my basis of my own observations, I would write things down. And then I would go tell this Koyukon person I worked with my idea. And she would just kind of nod. And then she would tell a story that would illustrate the point I was making. And then, so I did this a couple times, and I thought, oh, education through stories. And so I said, and also you have education through stories. And she said, and she nodded, and then she told a story about telling stories. And she waited until there's just one thing I never thought of, and if I have time, I'll talk about that at the end. But I want to give it a little bit of history of semantics and story, particularly in the field of linguistics and anthropology. Anthropologists have had a lot, not anthropologists, linguists, people who study language have really had a love relationship with meaning, and mostly hate, because it's terribly messy. As you start, if you talk about meaning, you talk about things like the nature of thought, the nature of reality, and like who wants to talk about that? So you just do language. Let's do structure. One linguist said, if you invite meaning into your analysis, he brings along some unruly friends. Things like reality. But this is not the case in anthropology. And when you get the Vienna Circle, which is, centered in Vienna, but is the development of considered the modern logical empiricism as really the beginning, many viewed as like empirical science as we know it today. So they looked at a wide variety of things, and they tried to look at language, and it made no sense to them. And so they focused more on the logic than the empiricism, and would kind of work off made-up language, like this ideal language, which is totally Platonic, and they were all about Aristotle. And so, God, language, we have to go with Plato. Also in Europe, you have structuralism developing, which basically you just look at structure. That's the way it's presented now. It's a little more complex. But one of the leading figures in that was Roman Jakobson, who is called a structuralist, but he was also interested in literature. So he has writings on literature. But his writings on literature focused heavily on structure, like the structure of narrative. And people would take this to extremes to the extent it was just structure. And you have this this reaction to it came to be called post-structuralism, that sort of went to the other extreme. Now, in this country, you have structuralism having strong influence, but you have Franz Boas beginning American anthropology. And the Boasian approach was to view culture as a whole. Like you had to study everything, including language. But in terms of language, you couldn't just find all the nouns, find all the verbs, figure out the phonology. In order to do that, you had to collect the language, you had to study the language in context. And very often this would be the collection of texts. I had a friend who was a student of Lee Fan Kuei, who was a student of Edward Sapirs, who was kind of central to the Boasian tradition. And he wanted to study the Chippewayan language. It's a language spoken in Canada that Lee Fan Kuei had worked with. And Lee Fan Kuei said, okay, before I'll teach you anything, you need to memorize a story in this language. And so my friend memorized a story and said it by memory. And then said, okay, and then you can study the language. But at the beginning, it was roughly the 1950s, in the minds of some at least, linguistics and anthropology had a messy divorce, or maybe it was amicable for some. And then some people, they're still together. The minds of some of the children, they're still together. But the linguistics part just forgot about story, forgot about cultural context. Just we're talking about nouns and verbs. No, if you want to know tree, I can tell you about the phonology, but don't ask me the meaning of the word tree, let alone tell me a story about trees. That's irrelevant. Okay. So after this happened, in this context, meaning has kind of been creeping back in, and there's been a lot of interesting concepts. I want to talk about all these. Until yesterday, I thought I would do it the old-fashioned way and just get up and talk, like I did in my first. I guess I was getting nostalgic. And then yesterday I says, I need a PowerPoint. And so I put this together like really quickly. But I mentioned the embodied mind. Lexical semantics is the study of meaning of individual words. And propositional semantics, basically meanings of sentences or propositions. And the discourse pragmatics, or sometimes called pragmatics, is the broader context. And so where linguists really don't do much in the way of pragmatics or discourse semantics, except the subfield I come from. But a concept I think I'm going to get back to. We'll see what happens, but I may just end up talking like. But is a distinction between paradigmatic and syntagmatic. So when you talk about paradigmatic things, you're talking about members of a category, like nouns. Where syntagmatic would be how these go together. It could be, usually people think of it in terms of a sentence. So like the subject, what the various things it can be in the subject position are paradigmatic. And the syntagmatic, the structure of how they are strung together would be syntax or syntagmatic. But you can also talk about, like in an individual word, the phonemes that can appear in order would be paradigmatic, and the whole word, like how they go together, the rules for that is syntagmatic, or the structure of a story. And the structuralists would do paradigmatic and syntagmatic analyses of texts. But people doing lexical semantics, it's individual words, so that's totally paradigmatic. I want to talk a little bit about the interactive activation model of cognition, where the idea is that the meaning of a word is more like an encyclopedia than a dictionary. It's not like we have these little precise definitions in our head for a word like red, like a color, or whatever the dictionary definition of red is. It's like everything associated with that word. And actually the associations can be phonological. So, red, and think words that rhyme with red. But in terms of meaning, it would be things we think of prototypically as being red, like fire, the fire engine, other colors, cherries, apples. Of course, not all cherries and apples are red. But so if you encounter the word red, like you think of it or you read it or someone says it, all these things are activated. And all this network of activation would be the meaning of the word. And the general cultural meaning would be the network that everyone shares in common. But of course that can change over time, or you can have individual networks that are a little different. So we all understand the meaning of word. Well, let's see. I don't know, say red. Something terrible happened to you when you were wearing red, and so you have this really awful association with it that other people don't share. So you can have like general networks and so on. The problem, I'll tell you how they come up with the methods used to support this, but I wondered, do networks have to be totally about paradigmatic things? Like can a story or structure activate some other structure? Now the way they come up with networks like this is through one common method through what's called lexical decision task, where you have your subject sitting in front of a computer and you have words flash, and they push a button. Some are real words and some are not real words. You push one button if it's a real word, and another one if it's a fake word, like glop, or I don't know, glop is actually a word. I can't think of a fake word now, but lurtrum or something. So you push no if it's whatever fake word you can think of, and then yes if it's an actual word, like glop. And then so it takes people, I don't know, let's say a second to react, roughly. It's actually more like 700, but for the first time. But say you have red, and then the next word is cherry, it'll take you less time to react to cherry than if cherry had followed castle or something. And then something associated, because we think of cherries as being red, and so that tells the psychologist that when you encounter the word red, things like cherry are activated. But not only cherry, banana is too, because cherry is a fruit and banana's a fruit, and so banana's activated too, but not as much as cherry. So, banana after castle, long reaction time. Banana after cherry, hardly any reaction time, comparatively speaking. But banana after red, less than so than castle. Okay, so anyway, I'm spending more time setting this up than I had planned on. But it's not just, there are other networks involved, so people will use this method to study things like racial prejudice. Like you'll show of someone's face, so usually their eyes, and then then you do have a lexical decision task. So you're showing faces and then a lexical decision task. And so you show someone and then you say liar is a word. And if it's someone against whom you're prejudiced, your reaction time will be less. If for liar, for racial groups you don't like, or that you mistrust and so on. So anyway, can stories of the same genre activate other stories or aspects of a person's lives? And I mean, just anecdotally, I think that must be true. I'm not sure how it works cognitively. But how many times if someone told you a story, they're talking, conversing, and then you think of something that happened to you, so you want to tell that story. And it's considered a good cohesive conversation if people's stories are somehow related to each other, or I would say activated. If someone tells a totally irrelevant story, it's like a miscue. Okay, so now a little bit about what people have done in other fields. In linguistics, it's been mostly structural, but the psychologist said, suggests that when we're hearing someone tell a story, or in some cases reading the story works too, our minds enter into the mind of the protagonist. So in the second bullet point, the researchers did a series of experiments where they would ask the subjects to memorize the different rooms in a house and told them all the things that were in this house, what was in the corner, and so on. And then they would tell a story, and in the middle of the story ask someone to react to certain things. And there was less of a reaction time to things that were in the room that the protagonist was in. And so if the protagonist was in the kitchen and you know there was a vase of flowers in the kitchen, that would be activated, vase would be activated, but not, say, a teddy bear that was in the living room. But the teddy bear in the living room would be activated if the protagonist was in the living room. But then they also did an experiment where the subject might be in the kitchen thinking about the living room. Like you said, you're in the kitchen, so that's the location, but the protagonist is thinking, oh, I think I left something in the living room, and then teddy bear would be activated. Another study having to do with empathy has to do with pronoun choice. In this case, if someone's telling you something that happened to them, they can use first person, like I did this, or you can also use third person, he did this or she did that or whatever, as long as you understand whom. But also, you can sometimes use the second person, like imagining you walk into the store and the clerk says to you, "What are you doing here?" So you're actually using the second person. So the researchers told stories to people and then gave them quizzes about the content of the story. And so they used first person, second person, third person. And they tested the content at 10 minutes after the story and 3 days after the story was told. And whether it was 10 minutes or 3 days, if they used second person, they were much better at remembering the actions of the story and describing the story in an accurate way. It did not have an effect on the person to use in terms of things like whether there was a teddy bear or vase of flowers or something. Not the contextual aspects, but the actual actions themselves. As I said before, you can ask questions because if I'm confusing you. Another thing, you're getting back to structure, like the structuralists, there's some evidence to suggest that we actually impose narrative structure on the world. Like that's the way we make sense of things, is put some structure to it. I wanted to tell you, I forgot to say this. When this person, the Koikon person, said, we talked about learning in the Koikon way through storytelling. Later on, it occurred to me that everyone does that. Like I was working with the older Amish, they would tell stories to inform me of something. And I notice when I'm teaching, I tell a lot of stories. And that's not just a Koikon thing. Okay, anyway. So I think everyone tells a story. The cultural differences I'll get to at the end. But people have suggested that you can see that we think, we make choices are based on narrative structure. And if you present like random pictures to people, they'll connect them with a story. Like we want to put structure on things to make sense of it. I don't know how many of you have heard of this famous experiment. I don't know, famous, I guess if you haven't heard of it, it's not famous. But in psychology classes, they often talk about this experiment done in 1944, where Heider and Simmel made this video of little geometric shapes moving around and asked people to say what happened. And that should, okay, yeah. So this is their film. This is a 1944 film. So it's only a couple minutes, so I'll go ahead and play it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop now. I'm sorry you won't get to see the end of this. But, everyone lived happily ever after. By the way, in this experiment, a lot of people talk about that in terms of anthropomorphization. So, well, I hope you enjoyed the avant-garde film from the 1940s. But the people, they ask, okay, so tell me about what just happened. And so they would anthropomorphize, and so they talked about the big triangle being the bully, or they said that the triangles would be boys fighting over the girl. It was a circle, and that box was a house or something. And so they would come up with these anthropomorphizations, but also they would impose a story structure on it. And Heider and Simmel said, you know, it was just random geometric shapes moving around. There wasn't any of this, there weren't any bullies or girlfriends or anything like that. Which is true, except also, you notice the experiment was designed in such a way almost to invoke that. Geometric shapes don't normally move around, like things move around through some force. I mean, it might be the wind, but in this case it was an animator. And so when people animate, they're actually putting some story to it. But anyway, in their mind, they thought this was just random steps, shapes moving around. People would have a story. But when people are reconstructing their personal history or their sense of self, they use narrative structure. They also apply narrative structure to personal interactions, like the way we interact with each other on a broader level, or little stories. You might have to speak informally. And then there's people have thought that psychotherapy, one method of psychotherapy would to have people put some trauma into words, like if they're able to verbalize it, it'll help them recover. What this last study found is that it helped, but what helped is if they're able to put the trauma in, to talk about it in a coherent way. So the more coherent their description of it, the better, the more positive the effects would be of it. This next slide is my miscellaneous slide. But the first point is that the question is there's a difference between telling and reading, or hearing and reading a story. And there is a little bit of difference, and they both have positive characteristics. But if one particular test, I don't have the reference here. If you want it, I can find it. I have it on some other piece of paper. But so they told children in the school stories, like verbally, and they also read, in another case, they read children the stories. And they wanted to see how well they retained the stories. So, and they would ask children to recount, like, tell me what was the story. And if they heard it as opposed to, they heard it spoken instead of hearing it read, they were better able to describe the plot and the actions and so on. If they heard it read, then they were able to describe it in more coherent, complex sentences. So the stories, which they didn't really go beyond this, but to me it kind of suggests that the empathy part of hearing a story is stronger than if you hear a story spoken than if you hear it read. I imagine it exists either way. Because if someone's telling you a story, it's like a personal interaction. But if they're reading, it's just like, from a book, you're just a vehicle for the book to go out. And then there's a lot of literature on the effectiveness of persuasion. Lawyers who can tell a better story to the jury are more successful than those who don't tell stories or tell bad ones. The sermons, news accounts, politics, all of these stories have been found to be effective. Okay, now the cross-cultural differences. Bakhtin was I guess it'd be a 19th century German, well, really a polymath. People describe him as a philosopher. He's a whole bunch of things. But he developed the concept of the psychic, what he called the psychic unity of mankind, and Boas really liked this concept and picked up on it. It's continued as part of American anthropology. But what Bakhtin and Boas thought is that everyone in the world has the same mental cognitive abilities, and the mind works in the same way. And this was before the Sapir-Whorf stuff, but people's minds work the same way. They're just as intelligent, they have the same ability, and probably, didn't use this term, but they would also have activated networks, just like everyone else. Everyone in the world would be like that. But what the networks are would be different, and very specific things would be different. And so the cognitive importance of narrative in a general sense might be the same for everyone, like it's important and people use it for things like education and persuasion and so on. But the manner, the specific functions of the narrative would differ, the structures would be different. There's one study that is actually a dissertation, and so the only reference I have to that dissertation is in a book I can't find. I think I gave it, I'm giving away my books, and so I think I gave it away. But I remember this study, I remember the book that referred to it. But someone told Navajo stories to people in England and English stories to Navajos. And the English people would organize their stories and other things in terms of threes. There might be 3 little pigs or 3 blind mice or whatever, and the Navajos in 4s. And so the stories were structured in that way. And so neither the Navajos or English liked each other's stories. Like the English thought the Navajo story was too long, too much stuff going on, and the Navajos thought like the English stories never got finished. They were incomplete. And then they would ask them to tell the stories, and the Navajos would leave off, add on a section that wasn't there. Like they'd make it 4 parts, and then the English people telling the Navajo stories would just leave off a whole chunk of the story to make it fit the form. So it's a cool story. Sticking with the Navajo, this isn't exactly storytelling, but it's kind of similar. In 1966, Worth and Adair gave cameras to Navajo adolescents and said, go make a film. Said, here's how you work it. Make a film about whatever you want. And just in terms of content, the films turned out not to be goal-directed, but about process. Kind of avant-garde, slice of life films or whatever, what they came of. But there's also a lot of focus on motion and walking, which you also find in stories. Like Coyote Stories, I always start out, Coyote was walking along. Like one girl made a 20-minute film on weaving, and 15 minutes of that is like someone walking, like going out to get plants for the dye, and then going to the loom. Very little, 5 minutes was actual weaving. And then someone filmmaking, someone walking to the mine, looking, walking around, picking up nuggets and so on. And also, there are hardly any face shots. Like, if you take a picture of someone, at least you have to have their face. This is the way we think of it. Navajos got to have their feet. And so a lot of the films were cut off. And this could just be novice filmmakers. But Worth and Adair felt it was more than that. In terms of the goal-directed, not on the process, someone else looked at children who monolingual English speakers. It says English monolingual Navajo children. Navajo children didn't speak Navajo, didn't speak it very well. So they were very much English. They were in schools, but when they had them tell stories, there were still elements of the not traditional Navajo that lasted longer than the language. So there's a focus on the journey over the destination, and the emphasis on landscape, the journey along, a landscape along the journey, and then harmony. There's a Navajo notion of, they call hojong, meaning is translated sometimes as beauty or goodness or harmony. It's like the goal of life, to be totally balanced and good and so on. And the stories, the children place emphasis on harmony. That's a typo that I made just there. Instead of harmony, that last bullet point should be transmission of cultural values. This is the, you see in Navajo sacred songs and stories, you often see this phrase, which is like the ultimate goal of the Navajo life. And I guess it should be my goal for retirement too. But it's in old age, walking on a trail of beauty. God, I always got to be walking. It's not like I'm retired and then I've reached my end. It's like, now I got to start walking on a trail of beauty. And so I didn't have time to put in the tone marks and the nasalization marks. But anyway, hojong translated various ways. So you got to be, hojong has to be balanced, and then you have to be moving. I want to talk a little bit about Coyote Stories. Barry Tolkien is an anthropological folklorist. He did a lot of interesting work on various things, including Navajo. He lived with a Navajo family and observed them telling stories. But he said, you might have a story where Coyote takes his eyes out for some game, or there are several different versions of the story, and replaces them with pine pitch, and say that, and so the story ends, and that's the reason Coyote's eyes are yellow. And so if you ask white people, tell them that story, you have them read it, and ask them what it's about, they'll say, well, it's about how Coyote got yellow eyes. But to Navajo, that's totally, I mean, that's just some side thing. But to us, it's like the culmination story, boom, you got yellow eyes. That's what the story's about. Kind of like that's the moral of the story. But to the Navajo, it's about how Coyote lived in an imbalanced way. He didn't respect his body and suffered eye disease as a result of that. Like, the point of the story is you have to take care of yourself. You have to be good to yourself. It wasn't an explanation about how Coyote got yellow eyes. One of the things that, in terms of different structures, Barry Tolkien noticed is that, those of you in my folklore class read something by Barry Tolkien and might remember this, but in Coyote Stories, both white people and Navajo people will laugh, but they don't laugh at the same points. And so the Navajos laugh at some point where a taboo is broken, like something that messes up the hojon. Like if you do something wrong, it messes with the hojon. So for example, Coyote's walking along and he sees some prairie dogs and he gets mad at them, and the Navajos laugh at that point. Like, that's not a funny point to white people. Another time, and then he wants to drown them, so he makes a flood, but he gets swept away from in the flood. That's when white people might laugh, like he got his or something. Things like a roadrunner and Coyote. You laugh when Coyote suffers in some way. Hugh Yellowman was the patriarch of the family he lived with, but he was troubled that Coyote Stories were treated as children's fluff in the broader culture. So when white people started, they said, oh, these are charming stories, and started teaching them in school, they viewed them as like funny, fluffy little things. But to Hugh Yellowman and other Navajo, they're really core to the values of the culture. Like, they're all about living or not living, things that allow you to live in old age, walking on a trail of beauty. And he was really disturbed by Roadrunner cartoons. Like, that's no way to talk about Coyote. And they'll even tell, I say traditionally told in a family setting in the winter. That's one, that's where Barry Tolkien observed. But Coyote Stories are also told during healing ceremonies, like these really long. They're considered sacred stories, even though Navajo laugh at them. And is this the last slide? Yes, the last slide. There's hardly any time left. I guess I was taking longer than I was expected. But getting back to the Koyukon, the people I began with, and the stories I began my first anthropology lecture, the stories that I said are bizarre. A cultural value with the Koyukon is the children are expected to think for themselves. And so after I came up with all the methods of education, this Koyukon woman says, you're probably not going to think of this, so I'll just tell you. And that's it. We tell children things that aren't true, how we educate them. And so I said, oh yeah, right, I wouldn't have thought of that. And then she told a couple stories to illustrate that point. But I remember we were at a departmental picnic once, and in someone's backyard, and my son came up to me. He was young with his friends. He says, "We found a bee's nest," and I told him, "Oh, bees like it when you pet them. Go pet the bees." And he said no and ran off. And then this Koyukon woman was with me, and she got really serious. She said, "You're really raising your child well." So you can't just take people's word for them. And so the stories are really abstract, and so getting attacked by a giant blueberry could mean any number of things. And it's expected that people have different meanings. Like in terms of dream interpretation, she said two people could have exactly the same dream, but it mean two completely different things. And so the things are not laid out, like you don't, the whole point of the story is not easily accessible. And there's probably not one particular point. There's just things having to do with the way humans are. You can see a lot of human condition, human inclinations, and so on. And so you're expected to extract them. My friend who had to memorize the story said he thought, and there were elements, people have said this, that the acquisition of knowledge to Athabascans, the metaphor for that would be like berry picking. Like there's a whole bunch of little plants, like picking wild berries. They're just not all on a nice little bush for you to stand next to and get all of them. They're like scattered all over the place, and you have to see through the fluff. And so that's as far as I got, as much as I had time in my planning to come up with my PowerPoint. So does anyone have any questions? It's the end, so you can ask questions now, or statements. Yeah.
Dr. Thompson, about the compulsion to impose like a structure on narrative, is it like an inherent knowledge, do you think? Or is it something little kids are taught, you hear this info, so you need to make sense out of it, and for this reason? Or is it something we're born with?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I think, I would suspect that that's something humans everywhere do, is they want to structure something.
I was thinking of similarity in between cultures of different stories are kind of similar.
Yeah. I mean, the stories everywhere have structure, but the structure is different depending on the culture. But I should say that with modern, the way we think of education in schools and so on, textbooks, things are really deliberately structured, and so there might be more of this. Children's books and so on even will have a structure to them. And so there might be more than just people living in a more informal way. But I still think I'm sure there's structure everywhere. Any story in the world, you can see the structure to it, not necessarily what you expect, but that's just my own thought.
So yeah, I've got a few things. You were talking about how certain things will activate networks and neurologically, and I was just thinking about how the science might actually relate to some of the more phenomenological interests in meaning and memory and emotion and feeling, and how also when you were talking about the differences in terms of both recall as well as persuasion between things like somebody reading versus somebody telling an oral story. And I was thinking maybe even further, and I don't know if there's any research on this, seeing a physical play of the story or participating in that story and what that might do for retention and imposing kind of narrative structures. It's a way of kind of informing us, I think, of what is significant, or at least what's trying to be conveyed about the significance, if that's your intention.
Yeah, and I hadn't thought about that in terms of drama, but yeah, and again, so I don't know if there's been research, but you would think if you're actually not just visualizing someone saying, and then you walked into the room, but you're actually, or you see someone walk in the room, or you walk in the room yourself, that could have an effect.
I think there's like really fertile ground there for education as well as kind of for more academic interests, kind of bridging the science with phenomenological interests in how people actually experience things.
I mean, in second language acquisition, people have looked at that, and there's a theory that's really effective if people are physically involved, like some TPI they call total physical involvement. Like you just don't say this is a word for sit down. You have them actually sitting down and telling someone else to sit down.
So there's physical memory that's also, in terms of the network, activated.
Yeah,
with that.
no, that's right. The people in the researchers, at least the linguistics, just focused on lexical meaning. But as I said, you could look at racial prejudice, you could look at their physical actions and so on. Oh, one thing, I couldn't sure how to put this in, but in one study, they actually, some neurological studies looking for what areas of the brain are actually, light up or activated during different parts of the story. And when you, if you remember something like a smell, the smell areas of your brain will be activated. If you heard someone tell a story, the parts of the brain that are most activated would be the ones related to emotional response, and not so much like the visual areas if you're describing it, which I thought, and I'm not quite sure what to make about that.
So here's just another idea or thought that's only vaguely related that I was discussing with Professor Oden, and I wasn't sure if you would be familiar with this, but a colleague of mine presented recently at a conference. He's a linguist up at University of Michigan, and he was making the claim as it relates to kind of the whole Sapir-Whorf debates that Quechua speakers, when they were doing functional MRIs, because when they refer to objects, everything is referential to the object, and that it does actually, they do think about and perceive the world a bit differently in terms of spatial relationships. So you talk about a pencil, and it's in reference to the head of the pencil or the tail of the pencil, and it's just a different way of referring where objects are actually considered to be, I guess, animate beings that have anthropomorphized features. And so he was arguing, or said that there, I haven't seen the study, I haven't been able to find it, but he was claiming that there's actual functional MRIs indicating that how they use their language does kind of fire off different neurons.
Who was this?
Bruce Mannheim.
I'm not familiar with him.
Yeah, I don't know that he did the study himself. But.
Yeah, University of Michigan goes through linguistics professors like disposable diapers or something.
He's been there for a while.
They never get tenure. They publish like 2 books and be most popular teacher ever. So yeah, and I wasn't even aware he was there now. Good luck. I hope he stays.
He's been there for decades.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe he's the one that's kicking everyone else out.
He probably is.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hey.
You mentioned that when children read the story themselves, it leads to greater syntactic complexity.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering what you mean in terms of syntactic, like language structure or like story
Yeah, longer
structure?
sentences, more complex sentences, like embedded clauses, that kind of thing. I didn't recognize you until you started talking, though.
I cut my hair.
Yeah. Hi. Anything else? Okay. Now, go.
I'll snag on the one real quick.
Yeah.
Going along the same vein, does that evidence kind of go against the idea of like everybody has that type of learning? That they say that there's I'm a visual learner, I'm an auditory learner, does that kind of go against that idea where children, if they read it, it's not as well as listening to it?
So education is not my field, but whenever I hear someone say that, I think that's a gross oversimplification. It's like when people say I'm right-brained or I'm left-brained. It's much more complex than people make it out to be. But when people say I'm a visual learner, I think that's just one way of saying that I may have a hard time. Like I don't understand this. Yeah.
I remember reading Bruno Bettelheim's who was a psychoanalytic theorist. He was talking about how young children would be driven to read and reread and reread stories that were addressing particular kind of, in his view, psychoanalytic challenges. They were stuck in particular kind of stages of psychosexual development and that kind of thing. But we see that not just in young kids, we see that in adults who are just fixated with particular stories. There's particular narratives and stories or movies and whatnot that we're kind of drawn towards. Could you say something about why there would be, is it something about the narrative structure? Is it something about the particular issues that are raised in there that we find particularly evocative, particular stories individuals might be drawn towards in particular ways? That's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, Bruno uses of enchantment, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting article. Like, the reason you have so many wicked stepmothers is when, used to have a lot of orphans. And so that was totally psychoanalytic, which I thought was really interesting. But when you talk about, and that's something I hadn't thought about, but it's a really interesting question. Like sometimes just order, and it wouldn't necessarily predict what genre or what type of story you would go toward, but just some kind of comfort. So maybe like listening to music, just a way of making sense of things. And the way we make sense of things is there's a story. Hopefully it's not a story where everyone dies and the world blows up. Unless it's Koyukan. That's a really good point. I thought of that. I guess that would be supported by the fact that if you're able to, you've suffered a trauma and you're able to construct a coherent narrative of it, that's more helpful than if you just blabber.
Manage particular traumas you might have, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Particular.
Yeah. Can I finish my pizza now? Oh, yeah.